Hello, and welcome back everyone to yet another devlog for my indie game Pixel Pirates, a top-down game about piracy and exploration. To my returning viewers, it's good to see y'all again, and those who just stumbled in, it's great to have ya. I hope you stay and find some content that you enjoy. To start this devlog, I finally decided to brain vomit some ideas onto a whiteboard for things I want to get done. As you can see, there are quite a bit of different ideas, ranging from adding new features, to fixing completely broken ones, to just cleaning up my code and workspace a little bit. These won't all get done in this devlog, but at least gives me a place to start. Out of everything here, I think the ones I'll probably start with is fixing the slime's rigid body, so that way it actually stops against collidable objects, followed by adding a home location to the slime. When I say home location, I mean a spot on the map where the slime will spawn, and where it will try to stay near. Currently, when the game is running, the slime is free to go wherever they would like. Sometimes that means they stay near their spawn, but oftentimes it means they get stuck in the middle of nowhere, which is far from ideal. This home location will hopefully keep the slimes where I actually want them, while letting them venture around a little bit. If I had to guess, this will probably only take me a few days, and as it's Friday around 7:30 in the evening, my fingers are crossed that I'll get it done by the end of this weekend, and if not, early into next week. It is now midday on Monday, the 21st of July, and the progress I made this week was incredible. After looking for quite a while to figure out my issue when it came to collisions, I found out that it was because I was using a kinematic rigid body instead of a dynamic one, so the slime doesn't have physics-based collisions by default. I, however, am wanting to use a kinematic body, as it allows me greater control for how the slime moves, so I ended up having to rewrite some of the code in my movement script. While this wouldn't have been that big of an issue, I realized that I made some mistakes in the code that led to some other weird behaviors, as well as the fact I coupled the movement script too heavily with the slime, so I decided to overhaul the slime prefab in its entirety. First, I began by resetting up the slime's sprite, but this time instead of just using the sprite renderer component, I decided to implement it via a sprite library, so that way I could create many different versions of the slime for different areas or for different difficulties. Currently, I have the classic red, as well as the blue and yellow version, which are just hue-shifted versions of the red. The setup for the sprite library is only a little bit of extra time and effort compared to a regular sprite renderer animation, so that was definitely a plus. While on the topic of visuals, I've also added a health bar to the slime. This was a quick little addition and utilized the same exact code I already made for the player health system, so it didn't take long at all to implement. I think it's a nice change and allows the player to see the slime's health remaining very easily. The changes I made on the back end had nothing really of note. The slime now collides against walls most of the time, and the movement script is now redesigned in such a way that other enemies can use it pretty easily. Most likely the hardest part of adding another enemy will be actually drawing them, so I'll leave that for a day when I feel a little bit more artistically creative. Something that is very interesting that I did add is enemy drops. I spent a few minutes creating some basic red, blue, and yellow slime goo sprites, and turned them into item prefabs. I then added a little script into my enemy health script that calculated the chance of certain items dropping on death. The system doesn't work perfectly, as if you kill an enemy and pick up an item too fast, it'll spawn a second one of those items that's invisible, but overall, it works, and isn't that what's important? Taking another look at the board, I think I'm going to work on making additional sections of this current map. I want to eventually have it make its way to a little village, so I'll first draw up some ideas on the whiteboard, and then check back in with y'all when I actually put that into the game. It's been about a week and a half since that last update. Definitely more time than I would have liked, but a few things came up that took priority. That said, designing this next area turned out to be a much bigger task than I had originally expected. Just the planning phase alone took about an hour and a half, with each of the 6 sections actually designing them taking me between 1 and 2 hours each. On top of that, I had to create some new artwork for the cliffs and a bridge, which added just even more time to the process. But despite all that, I'm really happy with how this area turned out, and the fact it's fully functional now is a huge win in my book. As I said before I even started placing tiles in Unity, I began by drawing out the area. I knew I wanted my game's spaces to feel like a small puzzle that you have to figure out, and that I want to minimize the amount of useless space. I thought of having 2 different heights that the player can move around. Looking at the blueprint, all of the areas with green stripes are the low areas, and is where the player will spend a majority of their time. And the purple areas are the taller paths, which is at the very end. To begin, they are guided along a path with a handful of slimes until they're brought to a pool of water with 2 different paths branching from it, one to the east and one to the south. If the player goes south, they'll find more enemies and eventually make their way to a locked door. At this point, the player will backtrack and instead go down the east path, the only remaining path. After fighting some more slimes and picking up some amazing slime goo in the process, they eventually make their way to yet another pool of water with a chest on the other side. When they open it up, they are given a key and can make their way back to that locked door. This locked door then opens and allows the player to access the higher section, and ultimately it leads to them leaving this area. Once the blueprint was made, I could finally move on to placing actual tiles. I decided to chunk it out and do a section at a time, and I'm so incredibly glad I did. The first section I redid about a half dozen different times, because each time it just didn't feel quite right. Sometimes the walls were too tall, sometimes the pathways were too narrow or too tight or too large or anything like that, and other times the collisions weren't what I wanted. The list just goes on. I did eventually manage to land on a version I liked. With that first section done, the rest of the areas fell right into place, taking no more than an hour or 2 to design each of them, and now that I had the heights and widths I wanted, I could make more of them easily. With all the ground tiles placed down, next was time to work on the lock and key system. As I said before, I want the south part to be blocked by a locked door and the east path to contain the key to continue on. The way I ended up implementing the key system was pretty smart, and I'm definitely giving myself a pat on the back for it. First, I made another prefab named Key and attached the key sprite I made for it in A-Sprite. I then added all the components I used for my slime goo prefabs, but instead of tagging the item as an item, I tagged it as a key. This allowed me to add another condition to my item pickup script, that if the item was tagged as a key, then it wouldn't be added to my regular inventory, and would instead go into a special items inventory. This inventory will keep track of things such as how many keys the player has, and while it's not directly visible to the player right now, this should be a relatively easy UI for me to implement later on. If the player makes their way back to the gate, we'll notice that it now opens automatically. This is because there is a gate script attached to the gate object that waits for the player to collide with it. The script then double checks to make sure it's the player who's colliding with it, and that there's at least one key in the key inventory, and if both are true, then the gate opens up for the player. It may seem like a weird system, and it probably is, but hey, it works. I know this may not have been the most interesting devlog we've had so far, but the work I've made these last 2 weeks will be invaluable for me as I begin to actually turn this game from a mindless slime killing simulator into an actual game with story behind it. Going into this project, I really expected the programming to be the hardest part, but I'm now realizing that level design will be far more time consuming. While it is time consuming, I'm also really enjoying making levels that fit together like a puzzle. One of my favorite games ever is The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. Despite coming out over 30 years ago and is more than a decade older than I am, I loved that game because its level design was unmatched to anything I've ever seen, and even today. You would wander around a map that wasn't massive, but it wasn't tiny. At first, you were restricted to go down one path and one path only. but as you played, you gained abilities that unlocked new areas. I want to try and do what that game did with its level design, and make a world with complexity, with life, and that's filled with purposeful design decisions. I know I'm a long way off from that point, but hopefully I can eventually make it to that area. That's gonna wrap things up for this devlog. Huge thanks to everyone who stuck around to check out everything I've been working on over these past 2 weeks. It honestly means the world to me to see all of you enjoying these updates and asking for more. Your support truly keeps me going. It's crazy to me that we just started this journey over 2 months ago. I absolutely love sharing my progress with all of you, and I'm excited to keep these devlogs going for a long time to come. But for now, this feels like the perfect place to wrap things up. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!